Welcome everyone to another episode of Mass Timber March Madness. It's Friday and pleased to have Erica Spiritos here from Swinnerton. She's going to show you a lot of the many buildings Swinnerton has underway and from a general contractor's perspective. Thank you, Erica. Please take it away.
Greg, thank you so much for having me here. I'm thrilled that you were able to pull together this March Madness event in the midst of everything else that's been going on around us. Thank you. So I thought I would take this opportunity to reflect on the past year. It was a tumultuous one and one that upended us from our normal routines, and I think called upon us to ask questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and if we can do it differently. And so my hope is that I can spend this next hour with you all getting the wheels turning again, reminding us of what we went through collectively and individually as a society, our global community over the past year, and then also look forward to where we might go from here. So thanks for being here with me, and I will get started. I'm gonna first tell you a bit about the group that I work for, Swinerton Mass Timber. We are a division of Swinnerton Builders, which is a general contractor headquartered in the Bay Area. We've been operating since 1888, a 100% employee-owned company. And in about, I think in 2016-17, we got started on our first mass timber project, and from there decided to grow a mass timber division within Swinnerton. So we operate effectively as a subcontracting group. We do about 50% of our business for Swinnerton and about 50% for other general contractors across the United States. Our mission is to accelerate the mainstream adoption of mass timber construction by providing comprehensive engineering, procurement, and construction services in the U.S. commercial construction market. And since 2017, we've grown our team to 30 people who are working full-time on mass timber projects across the country. We work on projects from their little infant stages when it's a little baby seed and somebody's wondering if mass timber might be a good solution, all the way through the installation of that structure on site. So we have people doing engineering, design, management, fabrication is a new thing for us. Obviously the project management, procurement, and then of course the implementation of the work on site. We've structured ourselves to be vertically integrated through the mass timber supply chain, not in every aspect of the delivery, but in what we perceive to be the major pinch points in delivering a mass timber building. So we have in-house timber engineering services. We work with engineer of record or provide delegated design services on our projects. We do virtual construction, in-house shop drawings and detailing of all of the mass timber structures, and then coordination with all of the other building systems through that 3D environment. We do now, as of 2020, CNC fabrication for glulam, and I'll talk more about that. Obviously, prefabrication goes hand in hand with that, assembling custom hardware, pre-engineered connections, and then coding glulam members in our shop to send out to the site, and then assembling our projects in the field. Okay, so now that we've gone through like the context, let's dive into 2020. This is where I work. This is my home office, and these shelves my partner built for me during the pandemic when he was going stir crazy from leftover juniper wood that we had from planter boxes that we built out in our yard. You'll see on the desk a breast pump. Nobody says anything to me, but I am trying to feed twin babies and pumping milk probably, 6 times a day and nursing my boys. So if you don't see me on video, that's what I'm doing. I show this to you all because we all have stories like this. We all have been totally upended from our normal routines. I was pregnant during the pandemic and gave birth to twins in November, came back to work and have been, learning during this time how to be a working mom. And I'll remind us all that over 2 million women have left the workforce during the 2020 crises that we've been facing. So I'm grateful to be working. I love what I do. But, of course, we're all doing what we do in a very different way than we've been used to. So I want to connect with you all on that. Zooming out to talk about our projects, we were stalled on some of our projects. Some of them we did end up building 2 buildings in Central Oregon while wildfires were ravaging the western states. And in the midst of a global pandemic, lumber prices, as you know, were skyrocketing to 250% of what they typically are. At this time of year, and across the whole year, really, we saw escalation from April of 2020 through the summer. It dipped a bit, and now it's back up again to record highs. And I want to take a moment to reflect on that. The COVID pandemic was challenging for the supply chain in that it presented distribution issues with transportation of material and trucking, and it presented issues with, availability of labor to do the work. And then the wildfires presented a whole other host of issues in terms of just damage to equipment, loss of precious land and trees that had been growing for, in some instances 40 years and were ready to be harvested. So if you were a landowner and you were preparing for a harvest in 2021, 2022, and that land was affected by the wildfire, that's 40 years worth of work and love and energy and, profit that you forego in this natural disaster. So I want to remind us all of that. Zooming out again, we can remember what it was like to try and breathe this summer on the West Coast. It was, incredibly challenging to be in Western states at this time. I think all of us felt like it was a bit apocalyptic. And these wildfires that we're experiencing are a regular occurrence, and in many ways they are natural and part of the natural cycle of life. And yet we have realized that we have potentially been mismanaging or not managing lands that do need management, and that lack of forest management coupled with the impacts of climate change have led to a situation where we have enormous fuel loads in our forest lands, and that fuel load is just waiting for a moment to catch fire and to spread. And so we lost millions of acres of forest land in the western states this year. It was record breaking, and this is one set of natural disasters that we experienced this year. But there were $22 billion disasters in the United States in 2020 alone. That's a record number of billion-dollar natural disasters in a year. Collectively caused over $95 billion worth of damage that was possible to assess, and that doesn't count all of the, delayed onset damage, the mental health impacts, the health impacts of all of this. It's just loss of, property effectively. So there's a lot to mourn here. And I want to remind us that it's a global issue. So we are not alone in experiencing wildfire in the Pacific Northwest. This photo was taken in a state park in Australia. And what struck me about this photo, I gathered these photos from the New York Times 2020 Year in Review. What struck me about this photo was that our actions don't just impact humans. So you see the impact of our ways and our lifestyle on other species. Amidst a global pandemic and natural disasters. We are in a new era of civil rights movement in the United States. We are reckoning with social injustice that is long overdue in this country. And Black Lives Matter protests across all 50 states are inspiring policy change, corporate social responsibility, and individually causing us to rethink how we interact with people around us in our communities. So I don't want to depress us all. That's not my intention. I remind us of all of this because we have agency. We have a choice in how we show up in the world for each other. And I want us all to leave here today feeling inspired about what we can do. And for me, I'm really grateful because every day I get to wake up and work on something that I truly believe in. So Mass Timber is an invitation. It is an opportunity to build zero carbon buildings, to build seismically resilient buildings, to build deconstructible buildings, to build healthier homes, workplaces, schools, community spaces, to conserve and preserve forest ecosystems, to reduce the risk and severity of climate change and natural disasters, to support rural economies and communities, to be good stewards of the natural resources on which our lives depend, and to support life for other species. So I want to walk you through in the next, 20 minutes, some of the work that we've been doing behind the scenes to accelerate the adoption of mass timber in the US commercial construction market. And I'll start with Graham. So Graham Montgomery is our technical director. He's based out of Greenville, South Carolina. Graham does so much for our organization, and in a pandemic with a wife and 3 kids at home, he left his family for 2 weeks to go do fire testing for a 2-hour rated connection that he designed. So this is Graham at the Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio, Texas. Graham had been developing this connection because we realized that what was on the market was too expensive for tall timber buildings, and that with the new Type 4 construction opportunities that we were seeing and that were going to increasingly pop up around the country, we needed a cost-effective, constructible 2-hour rated beam to column connection. So this is one of the projects that Graham has been working on, and we have that connection now that we can employ on our projects. Graham's done a lot of other testing this year, vibration testing, moisture testing for screws installed into wood members and how they're affected by various moisture contents. But this fire testing is really exciting for the industry in terms of the opportunities it opens up to build safe, cost-effective, tall timber buildings. In 2020, we also opened a fabrication facility in Portland, Oregon. This is Daniel operating our Unitine CNC beam processor. We had some delays on our projects, and I think in hindsight, we're grateful for that because it allowed us to really spend time building out this facility and getting all geared up to fabricate glulam for our projects. And we embarked on this mission a couple of years ago in an effort to expand the glulam supply chain. So I think we're all excited about CLT, but remember that 40 to 50% of the wood on a mass timber building is glulam, and so that supply chain has to be robust as well. And what we noticed in the Pacific Northwest is that we have significant manufacturing capacity, but not significant fabrication capacity. So I distinguish between those two in that manufacturing is the gluing of lumber together to make a commodity beam, and fabrication is the customization of that commodity into a building component. And typically that's done now with CNC machines, although it's still possible to use hand tools. But that's that fabrication process that we're talking about. And so what this has allowed us to do is expand the supply chain to invite companies like Zippo Laminators and Calvert and Roseboro into the mass timber arena. And they would not have otherwise been able to participate for lack of 3D modeling capability and CNC machine capability. So we're hoping that by increasing the glue lamp supply options, we are able to increase competition in the market and drive down cost toward, ultimately accelerating the adoption of mass timber. We talk a lot about connection design and connection details in our buildings. Steel connections can account for 4 to 10% of that mass timber supply package. It can be a costly number depending on the amount of steel in that connection. And so one of the research projects we've been working on is to try and develop connections that really reduce the amount of steel in that connection to reduce the cost and take advantage of in this case, the bearing capacity of wood itself. So we are hearkening back to traditional joinery methods and using this mortise tenon approach to a beam to column connection, which is mechanically fastened with screws, but otherwise has no steel. And this is a 2-hour fully fire rated connection. And you can see here, there's some routing out of the material to accept fire tape. So we'll prefabricate this component with fire tape, and then that connection will be fully fire protected when it arrives on site. There's another opportunity that I think we're just beginning to talk about, which is designing for deconstruction. And a lot of people are wondering about end of life or end of use of mass timber buildings. And I think it's a great question to ask because nothing lasts forever. And so let's be intentional about how we design our buildings in ways that would allow us to reuse the components in another application after the building is no longer serving us. So we are thinking about, the components that go into the building and then the way that they're assembled and opportunities to then dismantle these buildings. So imagine that as you design your mass timber projects. Currently in our fabrication facility and upstream into the manufacturing, we use a software called Manufacton, which allows us to trace and track our components from the manufacturing facility into the field. So every component, and actually it begins in the model. So we can identify various characteristics, moisture content, sizing, sequence of installation, and then track where these materials are in their life cycle to getting to the site. And then if at any point in time we need to get information about that material, we can scan the QR code and get information. But imagine with me for a moment a future where this continues and we've got etched into the side of a building a QR code that someone in 100 or 200 or 300 years could scan and receive information about every single component that's in that building and how to dismantle the building safely and effectively for maximizing reuse of those materials in a different application. We're not there yet, but we're asking those questions and we're thinking it might be possible. Another thing we've been working on is labor productivity and improving safety outcomes on site. So what you're looking at here is a robot that installs self-tapping screws. In this case, it's bearing screws that go from the CLT deck into the glulam beam below. And one of the challenges that we face on our sites is backstrain. So what we're trying to do here is reduce that load on our field labor. It's an incredibly taxing thing at the end of the day to just install hundreds of screws. And it it's aggregating impact over weeks. And so we think if we can avoid some of that, or at least supplement that work with some, robot that doesn't have a back to strain, then we might be able to, again, continue to accelerate the adoption of this construction type and improve safety and labor productivity on our sites. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about wood sourcing. A lot of people who are interested in mass timber buildings are curious about where the wood comes from. And I think that is totally understandable. Our humanity is so incredibly intertwined with this material. We use wood as our first shelter, as our first tool, and it's actually our use of wood for cooking and for fuel, for starting fires, that allowed us to cook food and extract nutrients enough to nourish our brains to the point where I could even give you this talk today. So I think it makes total sense to me why we care so much about understanding where the wood comes from on our projects. I think it's innate in who we are as humans. But there are no mechanisms to trace wood from engineered wood product back to the forest at scale. It relies on relationships and trust and just communication right now. And it's possible that in the future we develop those mechanisms. And right now we have proxies, we use FSC certification. But if we ever really wanted to know that the glulam beam that you see on the left is utilizing wood that came from the Coquille tribe lands that you see on the right, there's a lot of work that we can do. And I've been really privileged and just excited to be part of that work. And one thing I'll point out here for any kind of long span glulam nerds in the room is that this member that you're looking at here is an 80-foot long glulam member. And I can't really talk about this project, but we were able to eliminate a mid-span splice at this beam. It saved the project $1.5 million in the process and push the limits of manufacturing for long span glulam arches. So this is going to be a widely visible member at some point, and you can all go visit it. But I think in the meantime, we're figuring out not just how to build this incredibly demanding engineered wood product, but also how to make sure that the wood that is used in it is coming from forests that are managed in a way that makes us proud. So I want to end by sharing a passage from an essay. One of my favorite books of poetry that I read last night as I was falling asleep, by David White, who's a Pacific Northwest author, in his book Consolations. And this is a passage, an excerpt from his essay called Courage. Courage is the measure of our heartfelt participation with life, with one another, with a community, a work, a future. To be courageous is not necessarily to go anywhere or do anything except to make conscious those things we already feel deeply, and then to live through the unending vulnerabilities of those consequences. To be courageous is to seat our feelings deeply in the body and in the world, to live up to and into the necessities of relationships that often already exist with things we find we already care deeply about, with a person, a future, a possibility in society, or with an unknown that begs us on and always has begged us on. To be courageous is to stay close to the way we are made. I leave you with that because I think 2020 has forced us to reconcile our work life and our home life. And in many ways remind us at work of why we're doing what we're doing, because we're surrounded by the people we love all the time, working from home. And so I hope that this time we've spent here this morning inspires you all to be courageous today and in the time ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, for an excellent presentation, and especially thank you for making it so personal. I mean, and authentic. You're so knowledgeable about mass timber, and you're so passionate about it. It's great to have you as a recognized voice. Wonderful.
Thanks.
Seriously. Yeah. Do you have time for some questions?
Absolutely.
But I don't know. I think all you're going to get is thank yous. No, seriously. I'll read through them. I'm just going to read a couple of the messages. Thank you, Erica, for presenting such an impactful message. I did not expect such a meaningful presentation. Love it. Again, thanks for the mix of inspiration and technical info. And as a fellow working mom who also had a new baby in fall 2020, thank you for acknowledging the unusual work-life balance we've all been juggling over the past year plus. Another one, thanks for sharing your personal story and tying mass timber into the larger world events. Thank you, Erica, for reminding us why this matters and being so amazingly human. Wonderful presentation, Erica. Again, the next one, thank you for bringing in the big picture in a larger context. I think there's just a general consensus, Erica. Thank you for being, yeah, so authentic and so real, the kind of voice we need. Wow. And then from your father, Erica, I'm so honored to be your father. Thank you for your humanity and your love of the world, Dad. Ooh, you're going to make everyone cry. Phew. Wow. Okay. I can keep reading them. I ask you to do that as well.
No question.
It's kind of hard after that presentation. Sorry. Here's one from Gus. From one parent to another, thank you for addressing the reality of the pandemic life and how to recenter our focus. Twins during COVID, impressive. And now here's one from Italy. Thanks, Erica. Keep up your courage. All the best. Wow, I'm glad I'm reading these because I don't think they're generally captured by Zoom, but I think with your emotion and everyone else's, it's pretty well captured. Let's see, I think all you're getting is appreciation and thank you and a really big boatload of that. All right, let's see if anyone has. Okay, I'll put in a question. How do we progress the work using mass timber while juggling the realities of cost and the ethical dilemma of sustainable forestry, i.e., Oregon's forest laws are not as progressive as Washington and California? Yeah, that's a big topic.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for such warm reception. I was hoping for some kind of inspiration in crafting this message to you all, and I'm really glad it resonated. I think there's a lot of work that we can continue to do, and I want to remind us all that the concrete and steel industries have had hundreds of years to get to where they are in terms of their optimization and their refinement of the system and their cost effectiveness and how well understood those systems are by the AEC community. And what has been accomplished in the mass timber industry in the last 10 years is incredible that we can compete. It's incredible. So I want to acknowledge all of the hard work that has been done up until now to get to where we are. And yes, there is a lot of work to continue to do, but we've managed to do in a very short time some pretty incredible things that we could even be building tall timber buildings and having that be the most cost-effective solution for our cities. In terms of forestry practices, I think you're right to acknowledge that the baseline needs to be elevated. And we do that by continuing to demand more and better and asking questions and talking to people and seeking to understand why things are the way they are now. I think certification is helpful incentive for all of us to think about what's possible, but in the Pacific Northwest, only 5 to 10% of lands are FSC certified, and it's not enough, right? So you're right that the OFPA has to be improved, and there is work that's happening and it is changing. And I think at the Mass Timber Conference, Mike from OFRI is going to speak about some of that stuff. He's going to give a tour of Oregon forests. So keep pushing for it.
No, thanks. And I just want to, another relevant issue, there's an explosion of more people who are homeless here, especially on the West Coast. We're seeing it everywhere. So we have a massive housing shortage. We had these ridiculous forest fires. I contacted OFRI and I said, do you have data yet on how many homes could have been constructed just from the wood that burned in the last year?
I know, it's such a, did they have data?
Yeah, just such a lost opportunity, all that carbon release, and here we have all that need for housing. So they didn't have the data yet. They said that's coming. I know, like in Frères is trying, there's a massive push to salvage lumber while it's still usable. But yeah, thank you. I think that fits well with your passion for the industry and why we need this. Here's another question from Kathy Justice. It says, it sounds as if construction in the rainy Pacific Northwest is an issue for mass timber. Do you have recommendations on how to deal with that?
Sure. We build most of our buildings in the rain. And there are preventative measures that we do take to protect the wood. And I would break strategies down into structural protection and our, kind of visual aesthetic protection. So one would be, ensuring structural integrity of the member when it gets wet, and the other is just preventing staining of the timber. So we do the normal things like applying wax edge sealer to the end grain of all of our components. We use seam tapes at the joints between all CLT panels on our projects. We have recently started to replace plywood splines, which is the joint used to fasten CLT panels together, with sheet metal splines. And we find that works really well because the plywood ends up acting like a sponge and just soaking up a lot of water, and it can then be hard to dry out that deck. So we've had a lot of success with sheet metal splines. I think it's possible to prefabricate or pre-apply roof membranes onto CLT panels. We've done that on a project that we built this past winter in Portland. And to prevent staining, we want to avoid field welding of any steel components. If you're using like a steel brace frame as the lateral system, we want to figure out coatings like epoxy coatings on primers on our steel connectors, which is, we found, one good way to prevent steel staining of the timber. So those are a few things that we do, and I think the perceived risk is in some ways greater than the actual risk, and it's possible to clean the wood if it gets dirty. So we just expect it to get wet now, and we do some preventative things to protect the wood, and then also hold a little money in our budget to care for it at the end of construction.
Thank you. And here's a question from Lech Muzinski. Erica, could you elaborate on Swinnerton's efforts to design for the end of life?
I think we're just beginning to go down that road. A lot of it has to do with documentation, but other aspects are, thinking about other dry materials that we might use in our floor assemblies in lieu of concrete or gypcrete. I'm really curious about that. So it's harder to disassemble a timber concrete composite deck, or even if it's not composite, a concrete topping slab on CLT deck. I think we've figured out how to disassemble glue lam. We have to do it often because sometimes we install beams backwards. So, we have to take the beam out and flip it around. But in terms of the deck, I think that's where there's like the greatest opportunity to explore new frontiers with different materials that provide mass, sound separation. I think whenever we can use the CLT as the diaphragm, as the horizontal diaphragm, that's helpful because then we're not relying on a reinforced concrete topping to do that work. But yeah, there's lots of exploring that we can do. And if you're interested, I'd love to work with you on it.
Thank you. Here's a question from Tena Petrovic. How do you address the usual star architect steel and concrete visual design preference in contemporary architecture and make mass timber more appealing and attractive for general audiences?
I don't know. You're experiencing that most people have an aesthetic preference toward concrete and steel? I think without knowing much about your specific project or experience, I would say continuing to share stories, take people to visit mass timber buildings. Being in a mass timber building feels different. And we see and understand now, we've started to quantify the physiological benefits of being in mass timber building in terms of just overall health, wellness, reduced stress levels, increased productivity. And so if that data doesn't speak volumes, then maybe just the feeling that one gets by walking around the space might help. And I think part of it is just familiarity, and we do what we are comfortable with. And so if someone's not educated about mass timber, they might not feel ready to step into designing a mass timber building. But that doesn't mean that you can't share the opportunity with them and tell them, I'll hold your hand and we can walk this path together and we're going to learn as we go. So I think all of us are learning as we go. And it's kind of a leap of faith that we take on our first project.
Yeah, thank you. And here's another question from Lek. Construction in a rainy climate. What do you think of the schemes of total construction site encapsulation practice in Nordic countries in Europe?
I've seen that tenting. I've watched videos of that. I think to be honest, we are hard pressed to meet owners' budgets. And so to add that additional means and methods of erecting under a tent or enclosing the building during construction feels just an unaffordable kind of unreachable, unattainable vision. I could be wrong, but that's been my experience. And so I think we have to think of other creative ways to protect individual components rather than to kind of put an umbrella over the whole building. But I do see that happening in Europe. So I'm kind of curious about how they do that cost-wise. And I think increasing the level of prefabrication for our buildings will really help. And that's twofold. It's, making sure that our schedules are condensed on site if we do much of that work off site in a controlled environment where we're not, working in the rain or the weather or the high winds. So that'll help as well.
There's some comments regarding there's land that is also SFI certified from the forest.org organization. And then there's here's a comment. In the US, we had many post and beam commercial and industrial facilities built. You mentioned formalizing reuse of timber you are now constructing. Why hasn't there been a larger approach to reuse timber in older facilities built in the late 19th or early 20th centuries?
I think people are definitely reusing those timbers, and I'm aware of several organizations who deconstruct old timber barns and other buildings and reuse them in all different applications, whether it be new buildings, moldings for houses, furniture. I think if we were to look into using it for mass timber buildings, I could see us utilizing old timbers as a structural frame for a mass timber building. I think an engineer might have a question about grading of the member and ensuring the structural capacity. But I imagine that's not a technological hurdle. That's kind of just a logistical hurdle, I think. So if we really wanted to do that, if we wanted to build a mass timber building with salvaged timbers, I think we could probably make that happen.
Okay, here's another question. We have an active project aimed at assessing CO2 and dollar cost of retrofitting and deconstruction in mass timber to complete the LCA through service life, including occasional retrofitting and end of life. It is also meant to pave the way towards design for deconstruction. Would you be interested in sharing information or collaboration?
Absolutely.
That would be great to see some more case studies, wouldn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. And I even want to add a comment regarding the reuse of timber. I do know it's great, and given the current wood prices, people are looking for wood anywhere they can find it.
Yeah.
Okay, and here's a comment from Michael. I believe the use of solid timber instead of glulam requires a 50% sacrifice of assumed strength due to unknown checks and other issues.
Yeah.
Thus, members need to be much larger than with glulam.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Other than more compliments, I think let's see, we're at here's one from Luciano. Any critical aspect in your manufacturing which needs to be solved?
Tolerances. You know, it's so interesting now that we have our own fabrication facility, we're finding that different manufacturers have varying levels of kind of conformance with standard tolerances, and it can vary by manufacturer, also just by piece. But when we're building precise kit of parts structures, you know, that 1/16 of an inch matters. And so we work around that. We do a lot of, you know, pre-measuring of the component before we put it on the CNC. And if we have to adjust the detail or the model for the cuts, then we do if we're kind of out of tolerance in the member. But I wonder if there's opportunity there to kind of fine tune manufacturing a bit. I think there's, man, and from a wood sourcing standpoint, I'd love to see us really explore the use of other wood species in our mass timber components to incentivize and promote greater diversity in our forest management, just more biodiversity. And I think that right now the burden is on manufacturers to certify new species, and that's a heavy kind of financial burden to carry. I know academic institutions, universities are taking on a lot of that research, like Clemson did with Southern Yellow Pine. But I think there's lots of opportunity in the Pacific Northwest to explore the use of other species. I'm sure Oregon State, University of Oregon are looking at that too. Those are just two ideas.
Thank you. Here's a question from me. How does one best keep up with all the things Swinnerton is doing in mass timber and keep up with Erica?
Thank you. Well, call me.
Perfect. Great. I will share this again on YouTube, and I guess Swinnerton has a website for their mass timber group. Isn't that true?
We do. SwinertonMassTimber.com.
Beautiful. Okay. think that's pretty much the end of the questions.
Awesome.
I'm sure people have many more, but thank you for your time and making time in your obviously very, very busy schedule.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, and see you at the Mass Timber Conference.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.